Find the derivative of g of x equals cotangent x divided by cosine x, A, by using the quotient rule, B, by taking the quotient first and differentiating the result. For part A, g of x is a quotient, a division, of two expressions, cotangent x divided by or over cosine x. We can therefore make use of the quotient rule for the derivative. G prime of x will be the quotient rule, the derivative of the numerator, derivative of cotangent, which is negative cosecant squared of x, times the denominator left alone, times cosine of x, minus the numerator left alone, cotangent of x, times the derivative of the denominator, derivative of cosine is negative sine of x, all over the denominator squared, cosine of x squared. So we have a negative cosecant squared x, cosine x, and then a negative cotangent times a negative sine will become positive cotangent x, sine of x, all over cosine of x squared, which can be written as cosine squared of x. Those mean the same thing. Now in the numerator, I have a simplification that can happen, not for the first term, because cosecant is 1 over sine, so that would be 1 over sine squared and then times cosine. But the second term, the cotangent, which is cosine over sine, multiplying a sine, I should be able to cancel that down to help simplify this. That's what I'm going to do next. So g prime of x is going to equal negative cosecant squared of x times cosine of x plus cotangent, which can be rewritten as cosine of x over sine of x, and then times the sine of x. I will have a sine of x in the numerator and denominator, and those will be able to cancel. All of this is still over the cosine squared of x. Now, a couple advantages of that. We now have a common factor of cosine that can factor out. But after factoring it out, we also have what will be a Pythagorean trig identity. When we factor our cosine out, it'll leave us with negative cosecant squared x for the first term, and then we took the cosine out of the second term, so it'll be just a plus 1. And on top of that, because we just factored a cosine of x out, we can cancel it with one of them from the denominator. Take this one out with one of these, not both of them. We have an identity for that numerator. It's a Pythagorean trig identity. I'll write it up at the top here. Cotan squared x plus 1 equals cosecant squared x. We need to rearrange it to make it look like what we see. That will entail subtracting the cosecant squared x to the left, so negative cosecant squared x plus 1, and subtracting the cotangent squared x to the right, negative cotangent squared x. That means we can now replace that numerator with negative cotangent squared x all over cosine of x. Cotangent squared is, well, cotangent is cosine over sine, and each of those squared. So cosine squared over sine squared. And then this entire thing divided by a cosine. Since we have a fraction in the numerator, I'm going to take the fraction in the denominator. Well, it's not a fraction just yet. Let's put it over 1 to make it a fraction. We will now reciprocate it and multiply it. And so g prime of x is going to become negative cosine squared of x over sine squared of x times 1 over cosine of x. And that will allow us to cancel the cosine that is in the denominator with one of them that's in the numerator, not both of them. And I'm left with negative cosine of x times a 1, which will still be negative cosine of x, divided by sine squared of x. Now we can go a little further with this. One option is to leave it as cosines and sines like this, but there's another possibility here where we can separate this like so. We will leave one of the signs under the cosine and move one off to be under a 1. Now the reason we do this is each of these can now be represented by a different trig function, because cosine over the sine can be rewritten as cotangent of x, and then 1 over the sine can be rewritten as the cosecant of x. So negative cotangent x cosecant x for our derivative g prime of x. Now for part B, we're going to take the quotient first. Our g of x is the cotangent of x divided by the cosine of x. The cotangent is the cosine over the sine, and then all of this over the cosine of x. Since we have a fraction in the numerator, we're going to want to reciprocate the denominator and multiply it with the numerator. Well, the denominator is not a fraction just yet. Let's make it a fraction. Let's put it over a 1. So now we have cosine of x over sine of x times the reciprocal, which will be 1 over the cosine of x. The cosine of x's can cancel from the numerator and denominator. Let's cancel those out, giving us a 1 over sine x. And 1 over sine can also be written as cosecant of x. So g of x actually is just equal to the cosecant of x. So what we did here is simplify the trig relations before the derivative instead of after the derivative. Now we can take the derivative of this, g prime of x. And the derivative of cosecant of x turns out to be negative cosecant x cotangent x. The order of multiplication doesn't matter, so what we have here in part B for the derivative g prime of x does match exactly what we have in part A for the derivative. There's your g prime of x, negative cosecant cotangent or negative cotangent cosecant.